Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the second half of the show. Devil's Advocate, Todd Shepherd filling in for John Caldera. I hope you had the chance to read an exclusive that we published on CompleteColorado.com a couple of weeks ago, and it had to do with some small businesses in Colorado that are facing some fines. And here we're talking about fines of $250,000 or more for some small businesses in Colorado because they didn't keep up with all of the particulars of their workers' compensation insurance that they're supposed to have. And there is a state law in Colorado that mandates that businesses that do business here in Colorado keep up with this kind of insurance. So we bring in now Jose Colon, who's the attorney to two of those people we featured in that article. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you bet. So give us a rundown, maybe just the quick 30 to 45-second version of what happened to your clients in terms of the state law says you have to have workers' comp and you have to have certain type of coverage requirements. What happened to your two clients?
Well, I actually have three, but of the two, at the end of the day, what they did was they were operating under the belief that they had everything they need to be compliant with the state, to include workers' comp insurance. In both cases, they relied on the representations of their brokers, and they believed they were within compliance. And sometime this year, or last year actually, they get a letter saying, no, you're not. And in one case, the fines were over $200,000, and in another, it's over $500,000. And so they found themselves in a situation that they felt was impossible. I mean, they did contact the Division of Workers' Comp.
And the Division of Workers' Comp is a subset of the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment.
That's right.
So so I'm sorry to cut you off, but continue. They contacted
they contacted the division, and the idea is that they're under the belief that working with the director of the division, they have an opportunity to appeal these fines. They have the opportunity to, at least it's not so much appeal it, but bring them down to a point where they're affordable. Neither one of my clients, or any of them, are actually trying to get out of not paying. The idea is these are so unreasonable that they shock the conscience.
Well, let's start there, for example, because not only did, and I'll use some names here. So in one example, we're talking about a gentleman whose name's Robert Duran. He owns a small vegetable and flower grow operation up in Longmont. Right. He has been fined $271,000, I believe. Your other clients own a small Mexican grill off 70th and Pecos. Their fines are over $500,000. But it's not just the amount of the fine, because, like, let's say, I mean, look, if you ran a manufacturing facility of 10,000 employees and you dropped your workers' comp for 3 or 4 months, that might be an appropriate size of a fine. But in this case, it's not just that they dropped it may be the wrong word because that sort of sounds intentional. Right. They lost their coverage for a bit, but it's the amount of time that goes by. I mean, describe what's happened to your clients.
So again, yeah, the fines and why they're so wildly large is that so once they fell into lapse and they didn't have it, the idea is that the legislature had set up a plan that they would be notified and they'd get back into compliance. However, under the rules set up, the workers' comp division, the director in particular, never set up a notification period. At least not within the rules that they promulgated. And so what you end up with...
So when you say a notification period, I mean, would I be stretching it to say something like a statute of limitations that people are familiar with committing a crime? You commit burglary, well, after 5 years go by, you can't be charged with that. So if in this case, like the Atunez family that owns the Mexican grill, right, their fines go back 5 years. Should there have been some sort of, let's say, statute of limitations that says, when the department catches people like this, right, they can only go back 180 days, well, 1 calendar year? Quite
honestly, there should have been. When the legislator put out the fiscal impact report for 2004, I believe it was, the understanding was that...
Okay, well, let me stop you right here, because the one thing that we haven't introduced in the discussion so far is, and I've mentioned that the Colorado Department of Labor and Enforcement has the power to fine businesses that don't keep this.
That's right.
But what changed really was that in 2005, the General Assembly passed a bill that gave the department this increased muscle. They wanted teeth, right, in the department for them to be able to go after businesses. And so this bill in 2005 authorized new fines that the department could issue for when they catch businesses like this. So based on that, I'm sorry, what you were saying about you were saying on the fiscal note.
So on the fiscal note, the idea was that the department would act, or the division would act quickly to notify people, and they would bring them into compliance. In fact, I was provided snippets from the actual hearings, and they had the House hearing in particular, in which one of the representatives, I think it was Carol Morgan, she actually came out and said this is something that would help support business and help support employees in keeping businesses continuing, but in compliance and keeping people employed. And Representative Coleman, who was the sponsor of the bill, but she couldn't have said it better herself. And so at the end of the day, the idea was that you would know in a very prompt amount of time you were out of compliance and you'd be brought back into compliance. So to come back to my clients, they weren't told until 2 and sometimes 5 years later. And one of the leading cases here, that person didn't find out until 8 years later they weren't in compliance.
So how do you answer someone, because I know when I published the story, I read some comments like this that said, hey, these people, you know, A, they fell outside of the law, and B, this was the second time that they had done it, because both Mr. Duran and the Atunez family that I mentioned, both of them were second-time violators. How do you answer people that make that rebuttal?
As far as what, falling out of the law?
Yeah.
Falling out of compliance?
Yeah, or aren't they asking to be punished in some way if they've fallen out of compliance a second time?
And here's the thing. No one is arguing that a fine isn't in order. No one's arguing that facially the statute is unconstitutional. It's how it's been applied in these cases. You know, waiting 2 years, 5 years, 8 years, that's ridiculous. I mean, quite honestly, there's no way that you're deterring anyone from that type of conduct. In fact, you might be over-deterring to a point where me as a small business hearing about these sorts of fines, why on earth do I want to come to Colorado and start working? I mean, that makes no sense. As an unsophisticated person who's working 80 hours a week, I'm not sure that I would be able to navigate the laws in Colorado to stay compliant looking at what these folks did. I mean, these are not sophisticated folks. These are not people with master's degrees in business. They relied on someone they thought was smarter than them in this field, and that's their broker. And that didn't work out.
I know, obviously, as I was working on composing the story for CompleteColorado.com, I got in touch with, as you mentioned, the representative who passed the bill in 2005, or she was one of many, but she was sort of the lead. Former state rep, Fran Coleman, a Democrat from Denver. She was very gracious with her time, and she was very accessible through the process to me. I know that as we were talking, though, she said, yeah, this is not what I've intended.
Right.
Have you had any progress? I know you've reached out to the Attorney General's office, because at the end of the day, it's the AG's office that really is the one that makes these businesses toe the line after they have been fined, or in some of these cases are in court.
Well, that's right. The people's attorney, the AG, basically is the one representing the division in these cases, right? So they're the ones who are forced to kind of, you know, act against these folks, you know, and the reality is that they are basically, I think they're in a hard place. I think, you know, I was able to get in contact with the AG's office, especially with Representative Coleman's help. And the hope is that we can provide a way that we can stay these fines until the 2017 legislature has a chance to really evaluate what's happening here before the courts have to step in and make a decision on their behalf. So
earlier when we were talking about Mr. Duran and the Atunezes, I said Duran's fine is $270,000. The Atunez family, their fine is $500, I think it's $17. Can you give us some sense of how big that is proportionally? I mean, Mr. Duran and the size of his business.
Well, Mr. Duran's business is about 7 employees, and his margins are pretty paper thin for a small business. In fact, all of them are about, you know, they gross about $30,000, $40,000 a year. So if you're asking someone to pay $270,000, $500,000, you're asking them to close their doors because they can't afford it. In fact, it's really cute because when you get the letter, it tells you, please send a cashier's check for X amount to the Division of Workers' Comp. As if that's a real thing, like that's going to happen.
So I know that really more or less the position of the division, at least not what they said to me, but what they've said in legal filings is, hey, look, the law's the law, and we just total up the fines. Do you agree with? I mean,
You know, they're right. The law is the law. However, the director is the one under the law who has the right to make what they call reasonable and proper rules, you know, for how this is applied to Colorado citizens. The mere fact that he decided to leave rules in place, because I don't believe he was the director at the time when these rules were promulgated, to leave rules in place that have absurd results, and then act like you didn't have any discretion whatsoever. I mean, that's kind of ludicrous. I mean, at the end of the day, in fact, what are you doing there? You're hired to do a job. What these administrators do is they're supposed to fill in the gaps of statutes. So it's not that the legislature missed something. It's that they relied on those administrators to come in, fill in gaps, fill in ambiguities. There's a timeline issue here. He didn't fill it. In fact, he's allowing folks to be fined for 8 years.
Let me bring you back to the timeline issue very quickly, because again, one of the things that I know Representative Coleman talked to me in loose terms that I wouldn't quote her, but she talked about, she's concerned that the insurance agents and brokers, that there's a communication gap between the customer, them, and the department in determining who's keeping up. Am I right?
Well, there shouldn't be, but yes, I think that's exactly what's going on. They're not hearing from their brokers what's happening with their policies. They're finding out from the workers' comp division what's going on years later. So yeah, I think there is a communication issue.
But wasn't there, I mean, when the law was set up, and we've got about 30 seconds left, when the law was set up, wasn't it in essence when the policy was shut down or something, that it would be the brokers that communicated to the division,
they're
right?
supposed to within 30 days tell the division what's going on. Within 30 days. They have not done that.
And so that's where the real disparity is 30 days to notify, and then Duran gets a fine that says you've been non-compliant since 2013.
Right. Right, and they'll close them down without even sending certified mail that they're fining them for X amount. You know,
right. Jose Colon with Pearson Elliott in Commerce City. If you're having a similar problem, you can look him up there. Thanks so much for being with us on the show.
Well, I appreciate your time.
Yeah, you bet. So we'll continue to follow this issue as it goes along. We'd also like to extend an invitation to the Department of Labor and Employment. If anyone would like to come on and spend an entire 15 minutes with us on the show, you know where to find me, and I'd be happy to spend all of that time with you here on Devil's Advocate. Todd Shepherd filling in for John Caldera. We'll see you next time.